In the unforgiving winter of the Bighorn Basin, a cold night didn't just freeze your skin. It was a silent executioner that could turn a sleeping child's breath into solid ice before her mother even knew she was gone. The wind that swept across the Wyoming territory in the late autumn of 1882 was not a mere breeze. It was a screaming monster, a relentless force of nature that clawed at every crack, seeking a way inside to steal the fragile life kept within. For Thomas Vance, a 36-year-old cabinetmaker who had brought his family west from the rolling, comfortable hills of Ohio, that first winter was an agonizing lesson in the sheer brutality of the frontier. He had built his family a home during his first summer in the Basin. It was a log cabin constructed with his own hands, using thick lodgepole pine logs that he had carefully felled, limbed, and notched. He had filled the gaps between the logs with moss and local clay, troweled smooth and packed tight. He had built a massive fieldstone fireplace on the northern wall and laid a raised wooden floor of split planks to keep the damp earth of the prairie from touching his family's feet. By every standard of the frontier, it was a fine, respectable home. But in Wyoming, respectability was a poor shield against the elements. When November arrived, the temperature dropped like a stone thrown down a dry well. The wind found every single seam in Thomas's cabin, mocking his careful craftsmanship. The draft did not merely creep across the floor. It rushed like an invisible river of ice. Every gust of wind scoured the exterior logs, stripping away the warmth of the hearth through convective cooling before it could ever settle in the room. Inside, the cabin became a battleground. Sarah, Thomas's wife, worked tirelessly to keep their two young daughters, 7-year-old Clara and 4-year-old Lucy, warm. She kept them swaddled in every woolen blanket, patch quilt, and heavy coat they owned, even when they sat right by the hearth. But the hearth was a deceitful friend. It burned hot and bright, consuming wood at a terrifying rate, but it only warmed what sat directly in front of it. 5 feet away from the flames, the air was cold enough to freeze. The water bucket sitting on the table near the western wall grew a thick skin of ice by midnight, even while the fireplace roared. The true nightmare began in December, when little Lucy developed a cough. It was not a simple sniffle. It was a deep, wet, chest-rattling sound that made Sarah's heart stop every time she heard it. Every frontier mother knew that sound. It was the sound of the winter croup, the wet shadow that took children in their sleep when the air in their bedrooms grew too cold to breathe. Sarah would sit by Lucy's bed, her own hands shivering, holding a warm cloth to her daughter's chest, while Thomas worked himself to exhaustion. Thomas's days became a blur of endless, brutal labor. He spent every daylight hour in the pine groves, his hands raw and blistered under his leather gloves. The biting cold made the pine trunks hard as iron, and every strike of his axe vibrated through his arms, rattling his teeth. He chopped, limbed, and hauled cordwood back to the cabin on a wooden sledge, his breath rising in thick, frozen clouds. By January, the math of their survival had become a terrifying reality. The cabin was consuming a cord of wood every 10 days. To keep his family's home even marginally livable, hovering at a freezing 40 degrees, Thomas was burning through what should have been a 2-month supply of fuel in a matter of weeks. His hands were constantly cracked, bleeding from the dry cold, and his face was lined with a deep, permanent exhaustion. He was spending nearly every waking hour working solely to keep his family from freezing, and still, he was losing the battle. One night, as Thomas sat by the dying embers of the hearth, his hands wrapped in rags to soothe his split skin, he heard Lucy cough from the back bedroom. It was a raspy, desperate sound. He walked to her bedside and looked down. Her face was pale, her tiny lips blue, her breath rising in a faint, frosty mist in the freezing room. Sarah was crying silently beside her, her head resting on her knees. Thomas stood there, the weight of the frontier pressing down on his chest. He looked at the log walls, at the frost coating the iron nails on the door, at the drafts whistling through the floorboards. He realized with absolute clarity that their traditional cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve. It was an environment that demanded everything they had and gave nothing but cold in return. If they stayed here, if they tried to survive another winter like this, his daughters would not see the spring. He had to find a different way, a way that did not rely on the endless, exhausting destruction of their resources just to stay alive. He needed a plan that worked with the earth, not against it. The spring of 1883 arrived with a slow, muddy thaw, and with it came a fragile relief. Lucy's rattling cough finally subsided, her cheeks returning to a healthy, youthful pink as the warm Wyoming sun melted the snowdrifts. But Thomas Vance remained a changed man. The terror of that winter had burned itself deep into his memory. While the other settlers in the Basin celebrated the spring by planting crops and repairing their barns, Thomas spent his days in quiet, intense observation. He spent hours studying the massive sandstone fireplace in their cabin. He noticed that long after the fire had gone out, the stones remained warm. If he placed his hand against the sandstone block at dawn, hours after the last log had burned to ash, he could still feel a gentle, persistent warmth radiating from the stone. It was a steady, enduring heat, not like the fierce, biting warmth of an active flame, but a stable reservoir of energy. He realized that the stone was acting as a thermal battery, absorbing the heat of the fire and releasing it slowly over time. Then, he looked at the earth beneath his boots. He remembered his uncle, who had kept a root cellar back in Ohio. In the hottest days of July, the cellar was cool and dark. In the freezing depths of January, the potatoes inside never froze. He realized that deep underground, the earth held a constant, stable temperature. In the Bighorn Basin, if you dug down 6 feet, the ground stayed at a steady 50 degrees, regardless of whether the surface was baking under a summer sun or buried under 4 feet of winter snow. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, drawing lines on a scrap of paper by the light of a tallow candle. He began to calculate. If he could build a shelter completely underground, he would no longer be fighting the wind. He would not be trying to heat a structure that was constantly being scoured by convective drafts. The earth itself would provide a baseline temperature of 50 degrees. He would only need to raise the temperature of the air by 15 degrees to make it comfortable, rather than trying to raise it by 70 degrees from the sub-zero temperatures of a Wyoming winter. He shared his plan with Sarah one evening. She looked at his drawings, her eyes wide with worry. An underground home, Thomas? Like a dugout? People will say we are living like wild animals. They will say we have given up. Let them say what they want, Sarah, Thomas said gently, his voice firm with resolve. The log cabin we live in now is a beautiful tomb. It nearly took Lucy from us. I would rather live in the earth and keep our daughters warm than live in a respectable house and bury them in the spring. Sarah looked at her husband's calloused, scarred hands, and then at her daughters playing quietly on the floor. She saw the truth in his eyes, and she nodded. If you believe it will keep them safe, Thomas, then we will dig. In June, Thomas selected a site on his property about 300 yards uphill from their cabin. It was a south-facing slope, positioned perfectly to capture the low winter sun. The soil was dry and rocky, which meant excellent drainage, and the natural grade of the hill would allow any water from the spring melt to flow away from the entrance rather than pooling inside. He began to stake out the dimensions. 18 feet wide, 24 feet deep. The neighbors who rode past the property began to notice his work. Silas Thorne, a prosperous wood merchant who owned the local sawmill and supplied most of the valley's building lumber, stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing. He watched Thomas drive stakes into the earth, a look of amusement on his broad face. "What are you building there, Vance?" Silas called out, his voice carrying across the quiet hillside. "A new root cellar? You've got enough potatoes to fill a hole that big?" "A new home, Silas," Thomas replied, not stopping his work. Silas laughed, a loud, booming sound. "A home? You're digging a cave, man. You've got a perfectly good cabin down there. Why would anyone choose to live in a hole like a badger? You're going to freeze in the damp earth, Vance. It's unnatural." Thomas didn't answer. He simply drove the last stake into the ground and reached for his shovel. He knew that words would not convince Silas, nor would they convince the other settlers who had already begun to whisper about the crazy woodworker who was digging his own grave on the hill. If you enjoy stories of frontier survival and traditional wisdom, please take a moment to subscribe our channel. We share forgotten techniques every week on our channel, showing how our ancestors survived when comfort wasn't an option. As the hot July sun rose over the basin, Thomas pushed his shovel into the dry Wyoming earth. He had a long, grueling task ahead of him, but every scoop of dirt he moved was a step toward a winter where his daughters would not have to sleep in their coats. He was not digging a cave. He was building a sanctuary. The summer of 1883 was one of the hottest in the history of the Wyoming Territory. The air in the Bighorn Basin was thick with dust and heat, and the sun beat down on the south-facing slope like an open furnace. But for Thomas Vance, there was no time to rest in the shade. He had only 3 months to complete his excavation before the autumn rains turned the soil to mud and the early winter frosts locked the ground like iron. He worked alone, rising before the sun and continuing until the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. The physical labor was grueling, a relentless assault on his muscles and joints. The soil was not soft loam. It was a packed mixture of dry clay, river gravel, and dense shale. Every strike of his pickaxe sent vibrations shuddering through his arms, his shoulders, and his spine. He dug down 14 feet into the hillside, carving out a massive rectangular cavity. His hands, though already calloused from years of woodworking, wore through 3 pairs of heavy leather gloves in the first month. Underneath the leather, his skin blistered, broke, and bled, eventually healing into thick, protective pads. The dust was constant, a fine, dry powder that coated his hair, filled his nose, and stung his throat, making him cough as he worked. He moved every shovelful of earth by hand, loading it into a heavy wooden wheelbarrow he had built from oak scraps. He wheeled the heavy loads up a steep wooden ramp, dumping the soil along the downhill side of the excavation to create a flat terrace that would help guide water away from the eventual entrance. The sheer weight of the earth he moved was staggering. He estimated he had excavated nearly 80 tons of soil and rock by the end of August. One hot afternoon, as Thomas was prying a massive granite boulder from the rear wall of the Hawk using a heavy pine lever, Silas Thorne rode by again. The wood merchant sat on his fine horse, looking down into the pit where Thomas stood, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face dark with dirt. "Vance, you're still at it?" Silas asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "I thought by now you'd have realized how foolish this is and come to my mill for some proper siding. You've dug yourself a fine grave down there. When the autumn rains come, that hill is going to slide right down and bury you and your family alive. It's a death trap, man." Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps. He looked up at Silas, his eyes calm and steady. "The hill is stable, Silas. The clay is packed tight, and the sandstone layers are holding the walls. It won't slide." Silas snorted, turning his horse. "You're a stubborn fool, Thomas Vance. You can't fight the earth. When your roof collapses under the snow, or your walls turn to mud, don't come begging to use my barn to shelter your girls. I warned you." The criticism from Silas was not the only voice of doubt in the valley. Thomas's work had become a running joke among the homesteaders. At the weekly church services, men would nudge each other when Thomas walked past, whispering about the mole man who was building a home for badgers. They couldn't understand why a skilled craftsman, a man who could build beautiful, straight-walled furniture, would choose to live in a dark, damp hole in the ground. But Thomas did not let their laughter distract him. He had spent his life working with wood, understanding how structures handle stress, how forces are distributed through materials. He knew that the earth, if handled with respect, was not an enemy. It was a protector. By the end of August, the excavation was complete. The 3 earthen walls stood straight and true, cut cleanly into the hillside. The floor was level, carved 18 inches below the surrounding grade to allow for the stone foundation he planned to lay. Thomas stood in the center of the deep, quiet Hawk, looking up at the sky. The temperature down in the pit was cool, nearly 15 degrees lower than the baking heat of the surface. He felt the stable, quiet energy of the earth surrounding him, and he knew, with a deep, quiet certainty, that his calculations were correct. He had completed the hardest part of the physical labor. Now, he had to build the shield that would hold the earth back and keep the warmth inside. As the September winds began to cool the basin, Thomas Vance transitioned from excavator to builder. The hole in the hillside was ready, but it was still just a hock of earth. To turn it into a home, he had to construct a roof that could support the immense weight of the soil and sod he planned to place on top, and build an interior that would act as a thermal battery. He began with the roof frame. He hauled heavy lodgepole pine beams, each 9 inches in diameter, from the mountain slopes. He notched these massive timbers directly into the sandstone bedrock at the rear of the excavation, creating a post and beam system that distributed the vertical load directly to the solid rock of the hill, rather than relying on the earthen walls. He placed the rafters every 18 inches, closer than any standard cabin roof, to ensure the structure could handle the weight of the dirt and the winter snows. Over the rafters, he nailed split pine planks, fitting them tight to create a solid wooden ceiling. Then came the critical layer of waterproofing. He stretched heavy canvas over the wooden planks, securing it with iron tacks. He saturated the canvas in hot pine tar, applying 3 thick coats until the fabric was black, stiff, and completely impermeable to water. This tarred canvas was his shield against the dampness of the earth above. Over the waterproof barrier, Thomas laid 12 inches of living sod, cut in neat squares from the valley floor. He packed the sod tight, ensuring the grass roots remained intact so they would knit together, creating a solid living blanket of earth that would shed rain and insulate the roof. Inside the shelter, he lowered the floor by another 18 inches, then laid a continuous foundation of flat sandstone blocks he had hauled from the creek bed. Each stone was placed in a bed of dry river sand, fitted tight like a puzzle. This sandstone floor, totaling nearly 1,200 pounds of mass, would act as his primary thermal reservoir, absorbing the heat of the room and keeping the cold of the ground from rising into their living space. On the front wall, the only wall exposed to the outside, Thomas built his fireplace. He used selected sandstone blocks, carving them with a chisel to fit together perfectly. He designed the firebox to be compact, much smaller than the massive hearth in his old cabin, and built a tall, narrow chimney that rose through the sod roof. He knew that a smaller firebox would burn wood more efficiently, while the tall chimney would create a powerful upward draft that would prevent backdraft smoke even in the coldest weather. In late October, as the first hard frost began to silver the grass, Jebediah Croft, the valley's most experienced builder and stonemason, stopped his wagon at the site. Jebediah was a quiet, solemn man, whose opinion on construction was respected by everyone in the territory. He walked down into the dugout, examining the sandstone floor, the post and beam roof structure, and the fireplace. "Thomas," Jebediah said, his voice quiet and steady, "your carpentry is sound, the joinery is tight, and these dumb could support a locomotive. But you're building a tomb, man. This earth is going to rot these logs within 3 years. The dampness will seep through the tarred canvas, and your family will be breathing mold all winter. And this fireplace, the firebox, is too small. You won't get enough draft to clear the smoke in a deep freeze. You'll suffocate in your sleep." Thomas looked at the fireplace, then at the thick sod roof overhead. "The pine tar will keep the moisture out, Jeb, and the soil is dry sandstone clay. It drains well. The narrow chimney creates a stronger draft because the air inside heats quickly. It will pull the smoke out, even at 30 below. Jebediah shook his head, walking back to his wagon. "I've built homes in these mountains for 20 years, Thomas. I know how wood and stone behave. This isn't a home. It's a cellar. Your wife and daughters deserve better than to live underground like animals. I hope your roof holds, but I wouldn't sleep under all that dirt if you paid me." Thomas did not let Jebediah's warning shake his resolve. He knew that traditional builders were trapped by their own habits. They knew how to build log cabins, so they assumed that was the only way to live. They couldn't see that their respectable cabins were bleeding heat and consuming their lives 1 cord of wood at a time. On October 28th, Thomas moved Sarah, Clara, and Lucy into the completed dugout. They brought only their essential belongings: their beds, their wooden table and chairs, their iron cook stove, and a few crates of provisions. The interior of the dugout was simple, clean, and dry. It smelled of pine tar, fresh-cut wood, and dry earth. When Thomas closed the heavy, insulated wooden door and lit the small stove, the room warmed to a comfortable 60 degrees within minutes. Outside, the first light snow of the season began to fall, drifting silently across the empty prairie. Inside, the Vance family sat around their table, the light of a single oil lamp reflecting off the clean earthen walls. Lucy did not cough once that night. She slept soundly under a single woolen blanket, her breath quiet and steady in the warm, still air. Thomas sat by the stove, his hands resting on his knees, and he knew that the real test was coming. But for the first time in a year, his family was sleeping in warmth. The storm arrived on the 14th of November, 1883, with the sudden violent force of a physical blow. There was no gentle transition, no warning period of light flurries. A massive high-pressure system, loaded with frigid Arctic air, descended from the Canadian plains, dropping the temperature in the Bighorn Basin from a mild 30 degrees to a bone-chilling minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 12 hours. With the cold came the wind. It was a relentless, howling gale that blew at a sustained speed of 50 miles per hour, with gusts that reached 70. The wind turned the air into something solid, a screaming force that carried dry, icy snow horizontally across the prairie. The snow didn't fall. It scoured, hitting structures like sand, finding every tiny crack, every pinhole in the chinking, every gap in the window frames. Across the valley, the traditional log cabins immediately began to fail. At the home of Silas Thorne, the wood merchant, the convective cooling of the wind was brutal. The 60-mile-per-hour gusts hit his spruce log walls, stripping away the heat of his massive fireplace as fast as the wood could burn. Inside, the temperature plummeted. Despite keeping a roaring fire going day and night, Silas's family huddled in their heavy coats, wrapped in blankets, their breath rising in thick clouds. By the second day of the freeze, Silas was burning through his seasoned wood at an alarming rate, consuming nearly half a cord every 3 days. He was forced to make dangerous trips to his outdoor woodpile, his face wrapped in wool, his eyes stinging from the horizontal snow. The wood in his pile, though covered by canvas, had absorbed moisture from the autumn rains and was now frozen solid. When he threw the icy logs on the fire, they hissed and steamed, filling his cabin with a thick, acrid smoke that made his children cough and weep. The cold was so severe that the atmospheric pressure changed, causing chimneys across the valley to fail. Cold, heavy air sank into the flues, overcoming the weak draft of the fireplaces and forcing dense, choking smoke back into the living spaces. At the home of Jebediah Croft, the stone fireplace fractured with a sharp report like a pistol shot. The extreme temperature difference between the blazing interior of the firebox and the sub-zero temperature of the exterior stone had caused the sandstone to crack under thermal shock, rendering his chimney unsafe. Families were forced to make desperate choices. Some abandoned their bedrooms, dragging their mattresses into the kitchen to sleep as close to their cookstoves as possible. Others closed off 3/4 of their homes, sealing the doors with heavy quilts, and lived in cramped, freezing spaces. Water buckets froze solid on kitchen tables. Frost grew thick on the interior log walls, sparkling in the lamplight like a cruel decoration. The wind never stopped. It was a constant, exhausting roar that rattled roof boards and shook timber frames, a sound that wore down the nerves of everyone in the basin. No one went outside unless their lives depended on it. The valley was silent, a frozen wasteland where every household was locked in a desperate, isolated struggle to keep their fires burning and their children alive. But on the south-facing slope of the hill, the Vance dugout sat in perfect silence. The wind screamed over the curved sod roof, but inside the earth-sheltered home, there was no sound, no draft, no movement of air. The heavy soil and living grass roots absorbed the impact of the wind, deflecting it over the hillside. The cabin logs, protected by 14 feet of earth, did not feel the convective scouring of the gale. The air inside remained still, quiet and warm. The Arctic freeze stalled over the Wyoming territory, refusing to move or relent. For 32 consecutive days, the thermometer at the general store never climbed above zero. It was the longest, most severe cold snap in the documented history of the region, a month-long siege of ice and wind that tested every homestead to its absolute limits. But inside the Vance dugout, the atmosphere was one of quiet, stable comfort. The temperature held steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, day and night, with a consistency that seemed almost magical compared to the freezing chaos of the valley. Thomas Vance had built a shelter that did not fight the winter. It bypassed it. The physics of his design performed exactly as he had planned. The 14 feet of earth surrounding his three walls acted as a massive thermal buffer. While the surface temperature dropped to 35 below zero, the soil at the depth of his dugout remained at its stable baseline of 50 degrees. The earth was not cold. It was a warm blanket that protected his walls from the sub-zero temperatures of the outside air. His roof, insulated by 12 inches of sod and a thick layer of accumulated snow, held the rising warmth of the room inside, preventing any heat from escaping through the ceiling. The sandstone floor, fully charged by the small iron stove, acted as a radiant heater, warming the air near the ground and ensuring that Clara and Lucy could play barefoot on the stones without ever feeling a chill. The moisture management system, which Jebediah Croft had predicted would fail, worked beautifully. The dry, porous sandstone clay of the hillside absorbed any excess humidity from cooking and respiration, while the narrow ventilation channels near the ceiling allowed stale air to escape without creating drafts. The air inside stayed dry, clean, and fresh, free from the dampness and mold that plagued traditional cabins. Thomas's firewood consumption was almost embarrassingly low. He burned only half a cord of wood every 2 weeks, a fraction of the 3 cords his neighbors were consuming. Because his walls did not lose heat to the wind, he only needed to run a small, moderate fire in his stove to maintain a comfortable temperature. His firewood, stored in the dry airlock corridor between the inner and outer doors, remained bone-dry and burned with a hot, clean efficiency that produced almost no smoke or creosote. Sarah spent her days in the warm, quiet room, sewing clothes for the girls and preparing simple, hot meals on the stove. Clara and Lucy did their schoolwork at the table, their faces bright and healthy. Lucy's chest was quiet. Her breathing was deep and regular, free from the dry, freezing air that had nearly claimed her life the previous winter. Thomas would stand at his south-facing window, looking out through the double-paned glass at the frozen, wind-scoured valley below. He could see the distant, heavy smoke plumes rising from the neighbors' cabins, and he knew that they were suffering. He knew that Silas Thorne was burning through his lumber, and Jebediah Croft was struggling with his fractured chimney. He felt no satisfaction in being right, only a deep, quiet gratitude that his family was safe. He had put his hands in the dirt. He had worked when others laughed. And now, the earth was rewarding his humility with warmth. If you want to learn more about the real techniques our ancestors used to survive the hardest winters, please take a moment to subscribe our channel. We share authentic, historically inspired reconstructions every week on our channel, showing how common sense and simple physics can defeat the most extreme elements. On the 32nd night of the freeze, Thomas sat by his stove, his daughters sleeping quietly in their warm beds nearby. He placed his hand against the sandstone wall. It was warm to the touch, holding the energy of the day, ready to release it slowly through the night. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen mountain, but inside, they were warm. He had built a shield of earth and stone, and it had held. On the 16th of December, 1883, the Arctic high-pressure system finally broke. The relentless, howling wind died down, and the temperature climbed slowly from the 30 below zero depths of the freeze to a relatively mild 15 degrees above zero. But as the skies cleared, the true cost of the 32-day freeze became visible. The Bighorn Basin was in ruins. Families emerged from their cabins looking haggard, exhausted, and thin. They had spent a month in survival mode, rationing their food, splitting frozen wood in the dark, and sleeping in their clothes. Many had lost livestock to the cold. Others had suffered frostbite or lung infections from breathing cold, smoke-filled air for weeks. Silas Thorne was in a desperate state. He had burned through his entire commercial lumber stash, his dining table, his chairs, and 2 of his children's bed frames just to keep his cabin above freezing. His youngest son had suffered frostbite on 3 fingers, and his wife was ill with a deep chest cough. He was out of wood, out of fuel, and out of hope. He pulled on his heavy coat and rode his horse slowly up the hill toward the Vance property. He had not heard from Thomas in a month, and he expected the worst. He expected to find the sod roof collapsed, the walls caved in, or the family frozen in their pit. But as he reached the crest of the hill, he saw the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. It was a thin, steady trail, rising vertically into the quiet morning air. There was no soot, no heavy black smoke, just a clean, gentle draft. He dismounted his horse and walked toward the entrance. The snow on the south-facing slope had drifted around the dome, but the entrance remained clear, protected by the angled walls Thomas had built. Silas knocked on the heavy wooden door. It opened almost immediately, and a wave of warm air hit him in the face. It was not a blast of hot, smoky air. It was a gentle, dry warmth that smelled of pine and clean earth. Thomas stood in the doorway, wearing only a flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled up. His face was relaxed, his hands healed and strong. He looked at Silas's frostbitten cheeks, his shivering frame, and his hollow, exhausted eyes. "Silas," Thomas said gently, "come inside, get out of the cold." Silas stepped through the airlock corridor and into the main room of the dugout. The transition was so sudden, so profound, that he stumbled, his knees shaking. The room was a comfortable 65 degrees. Sarah was sitting at the table, pouring hot tea into a tin cup, while Clara and Lucy played quietly on the sandstone floor, their feet bare, their faces bright and healthy. Silas looked at the barefoot children, then at the clean, dry earthen walls, and finally at the small stove that was burning with a quiet, steady warmth. He held his hands near the stove, his fingers aching as the circulation returned, and he began to weep. He did not cry from pain. He cried from the sheer, overwhelming relief of the warmth and from the heavy weight of his own foolish pride. "Thomas," Silas sobbed, his shoulders shaking, "I'm sorry. I called you a fool. I told everyone you were digging your own grave. And my family, we nearly froze to death in my respectable cabin. My boys' fingers are black from the cold, and we've burned our own furniture to stay alive. I was the fool, Thomas. I was the fool." Thomas placed a warm, strong hand on Silas's shoulder, guiding him to a chair near the stove. "Drink some tea, Silas. You don't need to apologize. You didn't know." "I should have known," Silas said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I should have looked at what you were doing instead of laughing. You built a home that protects your family, and I built a house that almost killed mine." By afternoon, word of Silas's visit had spread, and Jebediah Croft arrived at the Vance property, accompanied by 3 other homesteaders. They walked down into the dugout, their hats in their hands, their faces solemn and quiet. They did not come with advice or criticisms. They came with the quiet, humbled respect of men who had survived a disaster and wanted to understand why Thomas had not. Jebediah walked the perimeter of the room, running his rough hand along the sandstone floor and the dry earthen walls. He looked at the post and beam roof structure, which had supported the immense weight of the snow and sod without a single groan. He looked at the fireplace, which had drafted cleanly throughout the worst of the cold without ever filling the room with smoke. "Thomas," Jebediah said, his voice quiet and steady, "I've built homes in these mountains for 20 years. I've used the finest lumber, the best tools, and the most modern designs. But my cabin was a freezer this month. My chimney cracked, and my family was breathing smoke for 2 weeks. Your design, the mass, the earth, the passive heat, it outperformed everything I've ever built." He looked at Thomas, his eyes holding a deep, quiet respect. "You didn't build a cellar, Thomas. You built a future. Will you show us how to do it? Will you teach us how to build these dugouts before next winter comes?" Thomas smiled, a warm, quiet expression. "I will, Jeb. I'll help anyone who wants to build. It's not a secret. It's just working with the earth instead of fighting it." The emotional resolution of that afternoon was one that transformed the Bighorn Basin. The rivalry, the laughter, and the skepticism that had divided the community for months vanished, replaced by a shared commitment to survival and mutual support. The homesteaders realized that their traditional pride was a poor shield against the elements, and that the quiet cabinetmaker had shown them a smarter path forward. When the spring of 1884 arrived, the valley was alive with the sound of collective labor, but they were not building traditional log cabins. Silas Thorne, Jebediah Croft, and Thomas Vance led teams of neighbors, helping each family excavate south-facing slopes, haul creek sandstone, and lerp sod roofs. By the time the next winter arrived, 11 families in the Bighorn Basin were living in earth-sheltered homes, their children safe and warm. Thomas Vance stood on the crest of the hill, his hand resting on Sarah's waist. Below them, the valley was quiet, the smoke from the new dugouts rising in clean, thin trails against the autumn sky. He looked down at Clara and Lucy, who were running through the tall grass that grew on top of their own roof, their laughter echoing through the mountain air. He had not built a monument or sought fame. He had simply looked at his freezing daughters, trusted his observations, and dug into the earth until he found warmth. And in doing so, he had thopped up a light that would keep his family and his community safe for generations to come.